is the postdoc or one of the postdocs here that's been working with social networks and health for the last few years. She's also principal investigator of a really remarkable study that just got funded in rapid time from the CDC to use snowball sampling to do a version of RDS and develop this just a truly remarkable platform that helps communities roll out these kinds of tools. So anyway, Dana, this show's yours, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. So I do talk a little bit about that RDS study. It's a COVID contact tracing study funded by CDC. And one of the things that we are doing is developing open source turnkey software to, I'm not doing that, someone else is doing that, open source turnkey software so that people can use and deploy an RDS platform rapidly if and when the next pandemic occurs. So I will talk a little bit though about different link tracing designs, including ethics. So just as an introduction, link tracing can also be called chain referral sampling or snowball sampling. It's a peer-to-peer sampling method. So you start with people in the community, you consent and enroll them into the study. And then among other study activities, you ask them to bring in some of their social contacts as well for participation. So imagine starting with the dark blue nodes here in the graphic at the bottom. They might each bring in 3 people for enrollment. That's the line below them. And then each of those people might bring in some of their peers for enrollment. And then the chains or the waves move outward from there. So link tracing is especially effective in cases when you aren't sure who's in the population or risk set, and then you don't have a sampling frame. And this can be because frequently the population or the outcome is hidden. So people can be hidden from investigators for any number of reasons. There might be stigma. Link tracing has been deployed several times successfully among injecting drug users. And then it can also leverage trust among community co-members if you're working in a population of people who generally distrust the medical or research community. It can also help when the outcome or infection is very rare, because in some cases you have a community of people who organize around having the condition. When it's done correctly, link tracing can protect the privacy of population members as well. So potential contacts aren't identified by study participants that are enrolled. Instead, the study participants are asked to go back out into the community and recruit contacts into the study, but those contacts aren't identified or known to the investigators ahead of time. And that also gives community members a choice as to how much they want to participate in the study. It's based on the assumption that participants know their own networks better than any investigator ever could. And then finally, for the contact tracing SARS-CoV-2 study that Jim was talking about, it also approximates infectious processes. So if you think about when you have contact with someone, if that contact is effective to spread a bug from person to person, then those kinds of contacts are the same ones that you want to use when you're recruiting people into the study. And if you think about traditional public health contact tracing, it's more or less based around that principle. So starting with a seed case who's in the population of interest, seeds recruit their peers for participation. And this is generally done through passing recruitment coupons to their social contacts. And the peers can then choose to consent for participation. If they do, then they also receive their own coupons, which they give to their contacts. And then each step outward from the peer is called a wave or a generation. So one thing that makes these studies unique is that in addition to the compensation participants receive for traditional study activities, so if you complete a survey or have some kind of a medical test, participants are also compensated for their effort and time in recruiting contacts. And that's what the dual incentive structure is. So the primary incentive is what's a traditional incentive for doing a study activity. And then the secondary incentive is for recruiting. So all participants are eligible for primary incentives and for study activities. And then if they choose to recruit, they're all eligible for secondary incentives. Seeds are typically selected for convenience. So when a population is hidden enough that you are justified in employing a link tracing design, there's generally a reason. So you're starting with the seeds that you know. So the seeds are population members who are known to the investigators and willing to participate, and then ideally they have large personal networks containing more members of the population of interest. The number of coupons per participant is set during study design, and there are ethics involved in that as well, and we'll get to that. So non-seeds can only participate if they redeem a coupon given to them by an enrolled participant. And then the coupons are uniquely coded so that you can track who the distributing participant was when someone actually comes back in to redeem their coupon. So on the right is an early version of the electronic coupon that we were using for the contact tracing the SARS-CoV-2 study. So it is important to note, though, that when someone does come back in, the participants only recruit them into the study staff still do the informed consent and all the study procedures. So respondent-driven sampling is a set of variations on link tracing designs. And the commonality is, and Tyler and Jim were both talking about this, the commonality is the calculation of a probability estimator that allows researchers to weight the sample and to estimate the population. So you ask things about someone's network so that you can then scale that up, and then you can make inferences about the population while also having a sense of how biased the estimates might be. RDS samples do require the number of waves to be sufficiently large to reduce bias, and that's because they generally start as a convenience sample. And so a variation of an RDS sample to approach that of a simple random sample, you need a very, very large number of participants. So you need long waves or long chains because you have to get over a certain threshold value where you think that you've been able to reduce the bias, the variance, to the point that it is approaching that of a simple random sample. So it can be really expensive and inefficient to get to that very, very large sample size. And again, if you're starting with a sampling frame that you don't know, you might only be estimating what that design effect is at the beginning of the study. So an approach that's a variation of RDS is network sampling with memory. So in that case, more detailed information about network data is collected, and then the network is used to guide sampling in two ways. So using the network, the understanding of the network that you have from participants, you employ both a traditional RDS and then another way to sample from the network. And the goal then, and it actually does, is it reduces the sample size needed to lower the variance in your sample. So in network studies in general and link tracing especially, there are some potential harms to be aware of. So in any network collected, the risk of deductive disclosure is higher. So deductive disclosure is when you have enough information about a participant that even if you don't know, their name or their email address or their telephone number, you have enough bits of information about them that you can identify who that person is, and that's a deductive disclosure. So in any kind of a network study, the risk of deductive disclosure is higher because you're collecting more types of information and simply more information about a person. It's also more complicated, and you have to worry about the ethics because you're collecting information about social contacts who haven't consented to be in the study. So information about them, they haven't consented for you to learn that information about them. And this is the process of informed consent. So when done properly, contacts aren't identified to the investigators, and the study participants are the ones who are actively working to recruit participants into the study. So that means that researchers don't know if coupons were handed out or who might have received a coupon until that person presents for enrollment and then is consented into the study. So this is especially a concern if you're studying a population that is hidden because of stigma. In some cases, you're working in a population that might engage in behaviors that are considered criminalized. So if you're working in injecting drug users or people whose status alone can result in harm to them. So if you're working in a population of people who might be undocumented, then you have to be particularly careful when you're collecting information about people. So there is one report in the literature, and this is the third point, and it's the first reference here, where study respondents reported that they were coerced to enroll in the study. So because of the dual incentive structure, the person who does the recruitment will receive compensation if someone that they gave a coupon to returns and enrolls in the study. So in this case, it was among injecting drug users, and some of the people reported that they were coerced to enroll so that the dual incentive could be given to the person that gave them the coupon. However, that report generated swift and substantial controversy, and there were a lot of responses to that, and those are the 2nd through 5th references below. There were the responses included saying that the researchers didn't design the study well, they weren't carefully calibrating the compensation, and that in some of the harms that people experience, they actually weren't separated from issues caused by working in any other outreach program with injecting drug users. But I definitely encourage you to read those references, because there are a lot of things you have to be very, very careful about. So institutional review boards do look very carefully at studies employing link tracing designs. So related to the example on the prior slide, the compensation amounts need to be carefully considered per activity, including recruitment. So you want to ensure that when you're setting the compensation amounts, they're not large enough to be coercive. So relative to other study procedures and other potential studies that the population could enroll in, they should be lower amounts. You also have to be very careful about the population that you're working in. So there are excellent reviews in the literature about this. There are 2 of those cited below, describing how compensation amounts used can be helpful to the study without being coercive. And it's helpful to know what's worked in similar populations previously without inducing harms. So prior work can be helpful as well when you're thinking about the population, and that's the 3rd reference below. CDC employs RDS studies every couple of years to trace HIV infection, or to look at populations at risk for HIV. And there are some excellent guides to designing studies. And then finally, it's helpful in these kinds of studies to obtain something called a certificate of confidentiality, and you can obtain one from several US Department of Health and Human Services agencies. And a certificate of confidentiality states that your data for the study can't be obtained by any other source. So it can be extremely helpful, and it's a comfort to participants to know that no other agency can demand your data. So it's something that I do have for the contact tracing study, because we are potentially working in a population of people who might be undocumented. So it means that we don't have to share our data with ICE or other agencies, even if they demand it. So it protects the privacy of research subjects by stating that the data collected can't be demanded by another agency. And then finally, it's common in studies like this, because you're asking study participants to do recruitment, to provide study materials or scripts for people to use when they're trying to recruit their contacts. And all of those materials need to be approved by the IRB. There are also several suggested practices to mitigate harm. So setting the maximum number of coupons provided to any participants limits the potential compensation for participating in recruitment. And it's thought that that reduces the ability for any one person to decide that they want to coerce their entire social network to join. Again, the compensation for the secondary incentive should be sufficiently high that people want to help and participate, but also low enough that it doesn't induce coercion. And then third, to ensure that you're doing everything well, when coupon holding participants do present for enrollment, they should be asked about social harms that they experience related to enrollment. And those harms can range from, peer pressure or coercion to more serious harms as well. So that is just a brief introduction to link tracing designs. And I'm willing to talk, or I'd be happy to talk about, ethics in general for network data, or ethics specific to link tracing, if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
I think there's a question in the chat, which is, how did the IRB take the compensation in the COVID study, particularly with the opportunity to get immunized being one of the incentives.
Right. So when we started the study, we enrolled the first participant in December, and vaccines were not widely available then. We are in the process right now of pivoting towards serology testing so that we can still rest on the same social principles that we were resting on for the study, where we're basing enrollment on Durham County, which is the county around Duke University, and we're aiming to enroll as representative a cohort as possible. So what we want to do is we want to get a sense of the individual social network communities or micro communities in Durham County. So we are working towards serology testing instead of active infection tracing. Related to the IRB and incentives, we did end up having to go through a full review. We do have an approved dual incentive structure. It was initially declined, but we wrote a justification based on the fact that we were focusing specifically on communities at risk. And I can talk a little bit about Durham County, where we're working, because it's an extraordinarily diverse county. So Duke University is here in Durham County. It's a very, very diverse county. Less than half of county respondents are white. Most people are minority race. We have a substantial proportion of people who are foreign born, and 1 in 5 people don't speak English at home primarily. So it's very diverse in other ways too. 1 in 5 people have a master's degree or higher, but 1 in 8 people don't have high school equivalency, and both of those are among people aged 25 and older. There's also a lot of economic diversity. Around half of households are owner occupied. Most people do have internet though, but we have a substantial proportion of people living in poverty and with no health insurance. And then geographically, you're looking at the median income by census block group here. So the light blue contains the median, that's 80 to 100% of the median. Dark blue is above that, and then orange and yellow are below. And as you can guess, the city of Durham envelops the orange and yellow parts. So we are, as I said, trying really hard to engage a representative cohort of people, and this is because we don't necessarily know that we have a good sampling frame for who might have active SARS-CoV-2 at any given point. And one of the assumptions for RDS to be unbiased is that the chains can cross any social boundaries. And if that's not the case, you have to seed separately across those 2 boundaries. So one of the assumptions that we're making is that based on the primary language that you speak at home, those might be places where the chains might not cross the boundaries as easily. So we're separately seeding among Spanish-speaking and English-speaking people, because Spanish is the second most common language spoken in Durham. So we are trying to recruit people who are historically excluded from research, who are also the people that are most affected by SARS-CoV-2. So we did we did justify the dual incentive structure. We wrote a justification letter when it was initially declined. We went to full IRB review, and it was eventually approved. So just to talk very briefly about the epidemic. So this is the proportion of positive SARS-CoV-2 cases by racial and ethnic group in any given month in Durham County. It's not scaled for population size, so it's by month. On the left is March 2022, and the block all the way on the right is March 2021. So in March 2020, the green bar for white people dominates, and that likely reflects who is able to get tested. Right after that, cases soar among Hispanic and Latinx people, and those are the yellow bars, followed by Black or African American people in the indigo bars, and then white people in the green bars catch back up. So since the epidemic changes over time in any given community, we're trying very hard to be responsive. And so we want people to rapidly respond to the survey and help us find their contacts who might also be infected. So in our justification to the IRB, we noted that the compensation relative to other study procedures for bringing in any one other person is lower. It's $5 to $10 for any one person that you bring in. So relative to other COVID studies that were working at the same time, that compensation was quite low. Most people will receive 3 to 5 coupons, so that's not a lot. We hope that it wasn't enough to induce coercion, and we haven't had any reports of that. And we also noted that the compensation scheme is something that's employed by CDC, who's our sponsor in their HIV studies, and that it's been successfully used to try to encourage people who were historically excluded from engaging in research. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thanks. I'm just curious because I've had to deal with compensation questions before, but my compensation is never a social good. It's just money. And I felt like that adds an extra complexity, particularly when that social good is a limited supply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we aren't distributing vaccines. We do have some people on the study team that are community representatives. So if we do pivot toward serology, the hope is that we'll then work with our community partners so that they can do what they do well, and we can stand back and do what we do well, and work in those communities to increase messaging, or or bring in a vaccine campaign or something like that.
Other questions some folks have on for Dana or for any of us here on the panel? Just part of what we want to do is make sure network data collection is weird, in part because if it's a boundary sample thing, you end up having the whole population. So there's anonymity is really difficult. There is this secondary informant sort of question. So there's lots of ethical issues that get raised. So we're happy to, if you're planning a study or thinking about a study, or just curious about some of these issues, and this is a good time to air them and let folks air them out there. It's really difficult to do. And if you think about those of you that work with ad health data, or those of you that work with other private network data, if you know where the places are, you can know who the people are. And if link tracing design, if you're getting information about partners that they might not want to share. So there's a lot of nuances to the ways in which we can do this in a way that is both not harmful, which most of the times it's not, certainly not intended to be, but can't be exploited for harm in an unintended way. Please, Shannon.
I was just going to say, first off, really cool, and congratulations on your project. And secondly, I was wondering, so are there any like milestone markers on like this kind of functions in an R naught sort of way before the vaccine, and sort of we think about that and how that changes for the correlations, and then afterwards when this comes out, or Pfizer comes out and then Moderna comes out, because I know at the clinic I work at, we can't have Pfizer because we don't have the funds to kind of have that kind of freezer equipment. So is there anything that you've built in that you're kind of thinking about as far as milestones?
You're at Lincoln, right? I think yeah. So right now, when we were initially looking at active infection tracing, what the goal of the study is actually to try to increase the amount of efficiency in contact tracing, because contact tracing is a ring containment strategy. From the perspective of contact tracing, anytime you test someone and the result is negative, it's a waste of resources, right? Either you tested the person at the wrong time, or you tested someone who wasn't positive, and so you spent your effort to find that person, you spent limited resources to trace them. So initially our metric was to be able to use the social network survey and keep the proportion of positive tests above what was reported to the state public health lab at any given time. But we are very slow enrolling, and so we're hoping that the pivot to serology testing, which would be ideally with an at-home kit, what we want to do is we want to see how quickly we can scale up in any micro community, and also get a sense of where that mixing happens across those boundaries. So what the communities, the social network communities, not necessarily the geographic communities, are in Durham County by hitting, by really seeding the community a lot. And getting a sense of where the modularity and insularity boundaries are, the modular and insular boundaries are. And then if that's the case, if we can sort that out, knowing when the community threshold for immunity dips, because the tests don't distinguish in this case between natural immunity and vaccine-derived immunity, when we see that social network community dip, The idea would be now hit them with messaging to distance or vaccines.
Very cool.
So
Very, very cool.
we'll see. I hope so.
Please,
Allison?
Allison.
I have a question about that inadvertent disclosure about, like, say, stigmatizing behaviors of others
Yeah.
in your network. But if I figure out that for this woman, the person who's going to influence her behavior the most is that other person engaging in that same behavior, am I allowed to use that information to then go, I don't know, interview that person or seed an intervention with that? Can I use that information basically that
I don't think so. So if you, and there is actually a study, and I can find it and post it to the chat tomorrow, that looked at people's social and sexual network and found out that people who had social network, I forget what they called them, not exacerbators, but people that encourage risky behavior, then people started engaging in more risky sexual behavior. But no, you can't go back to that first person and say, you know, your peer pressure is harmful because you haven't consented that person in the study. If that's your question.
Yeah, like I can't use that as my sampling of the likely people that I should intervene with to then influence their networks.
That's a very subtle distinction of the question.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that you certainly can't. So it would really depend on the nature of the intervention, right? So you can use information about secondary contacts that, so long as there isn't any risk that it gets back to the original person who that person is, if they weren't considered in. Does that make sense? So so if a classic example is, if you ask people about their sexual networks, the last thing you want to do is show up on the porch and say, you know, I'm recruiting you because you were nominated in a sexual network survey, and you discover the person's married to somebody other than the person that you recruited, right? And so that's the classic example of a disclosure that would be problematic. On the other hand, if what you were doing is saying, look, somebody in your social network, nominated you to be part of a study, and the reasons you could have been nominated for this study include a whole list of things that are innocuous, plus some things that are not, then you might be able to do it. And so the key is, like, how much information gets back to them about how they were recruited or why. And what this rests on, the ability to do this secondary selection on the other people, is that you don't know that the information that you have about them is true. The information you have about people the information you have about the people you've not recruited is the property of the people who gave you that information, is not necessarily the quality of the people they're informing on. So it requires a bit of engagement and a bit of creative fiction to distinguish between what you know to be true versus what you suspect could be true. And those two things, that difference between those two things, provides a moment for you to engage in that activity. But it's a blurry line and it's high risk, and you need to have your IRB on board fully before you engage in it.
And the items that they could possibly been identified for, they have to be real items. Like you can't say this, and they were pretend items, and then there was something
Right.
else.
No, it's either got to be elements, and you have to have some people for whom it's true, right? So it's a cost issue as well. Now there are creative attempts to do this in a way that is completely blinded. In which case, Peter Behrman and I developed a survey strategy at one point where it was a link design kind of survey. We were trying to bring in romantic partners of the ad health participants once in one of the later waves after they were adults, and we were worried about this issue of contacting somebody's extramarital partner. And so what we ended up doing was making sure that essentially we were designing series of ego networks so that you could nominate alternative people, and to have them, and we could then match them without ever getting their names. And we were doing it through a series of essentially implicit associations. So we would ask how often a person, does the partner you're naming have a tattoo, have a, have a motorcycle, a series of features, all of which could plausibly be related to health, all of which no single one of which was identifying, but the string of all of them together would be identifying. And so by doing that, we could then say later that these two people nominated the same third party, and we know that by virtue of the things that they have in common with this list of ideas. And so that was a way of getting to those people without ever revealing to them or to any of us who the third party was. Please, Dan Brooke, your hand up.
Yeah, I think, Dana, you touched on this a little bit about, your social network or your potential social network influencing you to do behaviors that maybe, I think you referred to it as risky or something that can potentially lead to the health consequences that you're trying to study. So I'm thinking of somebody who no longer injects drugs, being contacted by somebody who is a big influencer, a big person in the community who maybe sells them the drugs or uses drugs with them, and they're no longer using drugs. And then by participating in RDS, they start using drugs or injecting drugs again. Has that come up in your IRB approval or any discussions on how you might mitigate that?
I have not heard of that coming up. That is an interesting problem. I suppose that is possible. You have someone who contacts you after you've been out of that community for a while. I did post the paper I was talking about. They were enablers, social network enablers, but I have not heard that come up. So in this case, for a COVID contact tracing study, I don't know if that's necessarily an issue, but that is an interesting problem. And I don't know, Jim, if you've heard of that happening.
Yeah, I've heard of it in one case, and
Okay.
Barry Popkin at Johns Hopkins is engaged with a group of researchers somewhere in Central Europe, and I'm just going to forget the exact space, but it is dealing with IDU directly and peer training of IDU, and the argument there is that there's an overlap between the intravenous drug population and the HIV population. And what they're trying to do is develop a recruitment tool to help create peer training for PrEP, if I remember correctly. I was talking to Barry about this a long time ago. But what that model involved was exactly this risk. And they had a hard time dealing with it. And their solution was to get only trainers that, if I remember right, and I should actually just email him and find out, but I remember, if my memory serves correctly, their solution was to only recruit trainers who had been sober for a certain extent of a length of time, but had gone through that process of recovery, so that they would be particularly sensitive to triggering other people. And again, I don't know, and then they had to do a good deal of documentation in order to show that this was a risk that they were aware of, and that they had strategies to try to help mitigate that risk. Part of that, though, I think was also this flip side, which is that the IRB is concerned with not with having zero risk, but with having relative risk compared to the benefit. And they also spend a lot of time talking about how if you want to get people in this population, which is at high risk to HIV, and given this population was very high, that the relative risk of a relapse was lower than the risk of death due to HIV without any kind of protective features. So it was a combination of combining the risk with the potential benefit. In this case, they could plausibly argue a really strong benefit.
Awesome, thank you.
Other questions or thoughts? The big lesson from all the work I've done in this, and I know that others that have done as well that I've talked to about it, is work closely with your IRB. Make sure that you have you have allies at IRB. You don't want to treat them as your opponents because they need to treat them as your collaborators. And also, don't be shy about digging into the social network community writ large to help with this. As part of the backstory with the recruitment that Dana didn't tell you is that when we were first rejected, for the work on a dual incentive, and we reached out to a bunch of people who had done these kinds of questions, and the community was really helpful in providing, helping us figure out what that calibration should be, and how to do it right, and how to educate the IRB, because the IRB usually wants to help investigators, but they do have a responsibility for safety, and so if they need to be educated, that's your job to educate them. And oftentimes, the only way we get educated is by asking people who did it first. And the journal Social Networks has a number of, I think it's done 2 special issues now on ethics of social network data collection. So don't be shy grabbing those as well.
Yes, I got some great information from other researchers that really, that was, the basis of the justification.
All right, this has been a long day on Zoom. Please don't be shy reaching out with other questions, and hopefully we'll get to see at least many of you tomorrow. And if you have questions as you watch the videos tonight, or other things that just pop in your head, emailing them to us is great, and we can bring them up in discussion tomorrow. So everyone have a good evening.